Have you ever treated a disease on your plants and you were not completely satisfied with the results? In this video, I will discuss the principles of plant disease management. Howdy, I'm Dr. Greg Church. I'm a plant pathologist, and I'm here to help you with your plants. Let's start by talking about, in general, plant health. Plant health is more than just the treatment. Oftentimes, people will go out to a garden center or big box store and they'll look for a product to solve a specific problem. And there are treatments out there. They do have a chance of success. However, plant disease management is a lot bigger issue than just a single treatment. Oftentimes we refer to these treatments as the silver bullet. That silver bullet is that one thing that you can do that solves all your problems. In reality, we're dealing with biological organisms that have life cycles, and they interact within their life cycle. And we have to understand those life cycles in order to implement management or control strategies to be successful. Therefore, just to rely on a single treatment to solve your problem is not an effective approach. We need to use the principles of plant disease management to the fullest to achieve success. In order to be more successful, we need to have a better understanding of plant diseases. It's important to understand the life cycles of both the plant, the pathogen, and any pests that may be involved in this problem. These organisms can interact, and actually, they've evolved to interact. And because we're talking about diseases, this is a negative thing. Unlike in a symbiotic relationship, there are no symbioses here. The pathogen is meant to harm the plant, and our goal here is to stop that or prevent it. Speaking of prevention, that's actually one of our best approaches to plant disease management. That's the first thing that we want to do is prevent the problems before they occur. And there are a lot of different practices that we can implement in our gardens, landscapes, and our farms. It's important to understand that the environment plays a critical role in the development of disease. There are three factors that affect the development of disease: the plant itself, the pathogen, and the environment. The environment plays a key role in the development of disease. The environment has to be conducive for disease to occur. For instance, a lot of diseases that cause leaf spots, these typically are fungal diseases. They require a certain amount of time where the leaves are wet. Therefore, if we were to irrigate in the evening, our leaves on our plants can stay wet for a long period of time before that water evaporates. And this gives the pathogen an optimal period of time in order to infect the leaves. This concept can be applied pretty much all diseases. It's important to consider the fact that some diseases require a vector to be transmitted in order to infect the plant. So that life cycle of the vector has to be considered. It's important to consider the fact that the environment can actually cause stress on the plant. Stress is a word that we refer to in the human condition, but we can apply the concepts of stress that we understand to plants. There are a lot of different aspects of the environment that can be stressful for plants. Extreme temperatures, extreme heat, extreme cold, also extreme wetness or extreme dryness. For instance, the lack of rainfall or drought causes a tremendous amount of stress. More and more often we're experiencing drought conditions. This is particularly stressful on our perennial plants, our trees, our shrubs, and our flowering perennials. Because these plants live year after year, there's an accumulation of stress, so to speak. This can predispose our plants to diseases and other problems. It reduces the overall health of the plant. Therefore, the plant is actually more susceptible to disease. Maintaining the health of a plant is critical in order to prevent disease. These factors of stress actually lead to poor health, less resilience, infection, infestation, and eventually death. In a previous episode, we talked about plant disease diagnosis. It's important to be able to recognize the different types of symptoms. We could categorize these different symptoms into the parts of the plant that they affect. For example, the leaf, the stem, and the roots, or the entire plant. It's important to be able to recognize or be able to use the terminology in order to find information about the particular problem. In a future episode, we can spend more time going through these different terminology for plant disease symptoms. When we're talking about plant disease, it's important not to leave out the pest. These are insects or mites that actually cause problems with plants, and so we should be able to identify and treat these problems as well. When we think about the different types of insect pests, we have our leaf feeders, our sap feeders, wood borers, and gall makers. This accounts for most of our plant pest problems. Okay, let's start walking through the different steps for plant disease management. As I mentioned earlier, the best approach is prevention. So we want to prevent a plant disease. There are a lot of different practices that we can take to prevent plant diseases. Our first step is to try to prevent the disease before it occurs. This concept of prevention and disease management can encompass a lot of different approaches. The first approach would be resistance. Making sure your plant is resistant to a disease or pest is your best approach. That's a free approach. You plant it and you don't have to worry that that disease will occur. There are a lot of different types of resistance in plants. In many cases, we think of it as a scale, where on one side of the scale is susceptibility, where disease can occur. The other side of the scale is immunity. Obviously, we want to plant plants that are immune to a disease. However, there's always a compromise. Some plants don't have any resistance available, and we desire to plant that particular type of plant. We have to accept the responsibility of that action, and we have to realize that we have to manage a disease now, because there's always a risk that disease may occur, and it's your responsibility to maintain the health of your plant. Our next step is to monitor. We want to monitor the health of our plant, especially if we have a plant that has the potential to get sick. This can be regular inspections. You can hire a professional to do this on a regular basis, and they can inspect your plants and identify and advise on how to best manage that particular plant and the diseases that can occur on that plant. In our society, life is often busy, and we may overlook the problems that are occurring on our plants. I'd encourage you to take a moment to check your plants. Our next step in plant disease management is to identify the problem. In our previous video, we talked about plant disease diagnosis, and you can go back and watch that video for more information about how we identify the problem. Identifying the problem is critical to be able to select the correct management strategy. Once we've identified the problem, we need to assess the overall impact that problem is having on the plant. For instance, we may have a large tree and only a few of the leaves have a disease. Is that problem going to have a big impact on the health of the tree? Not likely. It could become a problem later if the environment is conducive for disease to develop further. Therefore, assessing the overall impact of the disease on the health of the plant is important in order to consider the next step, which is implement a controlled tactic. It's important to assess the overall impact of the disease in order to determine the most appropriate control tactic. Our next step is to evaluate. That is to evaluate the results of your control tactic in order to determine if additional tactics should be implemented. This is important because if we're not going back and evaluating the results or success of our treatment protocol, then we don't know if we've actually controlled the problem. Now let's consider plant disease management principles. Our first principle is resistance. Resistance is going to be our most important strategy to managing plant diseases. Resistance is the genetically inherited traits of a plant that provide resistance to a pest or disease. This principle is important when we're planning and designing our landscape, our garden, or considering the varieties that we're going to plant on our farm. Resistance can be full immunity or it can be tolerance to a disease. So it's important to understand what level of resistance is available in the particular plant you're considering. Always try to choose the one that has resistance to a disease. For instance, Indian hawthorn is a popular shrub. It's susceptible to a disease called Entomosporium leaf spot. However, some varieties have resistance to that disease, while others are very susceptible. So for planning a landscape design, it's important to consider the resistant varieties in the landscape design. Our next principle is exclusion. This is where we're trying to exclude the pathogen from the environment, from the plant, from causing disease. Part of that is quarantine and inspection is an aspect of this. This is where the government tries to prevent that disease from coming into our country by excluding or inspecting plants that could harbor this disease. This principle can be applied to our gardens itself. We can exclude these pathogens that may be harbored on the plants that are brought into our gardens. So selecting plants that are not showing symptoms of disease is important. This can be applied to plant pests as well, and excluding them or inspecting our plants for the presence of a pest. This is also important when we consider the materials that we bring into our garden. For instance, our soil. Our soil can harbor a lot of different issues. Soil-borne diseases, insects, and other issues. So it's important to, if we're going to add soil to our garden or landscape, it's important to know where that soil came from. Another principle is avoidance. This is where we want to avoid the conditions that cause disease. An example of this is in our gardens. We can change the planting date to try to avoid a disease or the conditions that are conducive for disease. For instance, a later planting date may result in young plants being exposed to a disease and an environment that's conducive for disease, while if we planted earlier, the older plant may be more resistant to that disease at the time when the environment is more conducive for disease. Another principle of plant disease management is protection. Protection can come in different forms. Most often we consider applying a product on a plant to protect it, but protection can go further than just products. Protection can simply be using row covers or screening to protect the plant. It could be growing the plants in greenhouses instead of out in the open field. It can be growing the plants in raised beds instead of directly in the ground. But oftentimes the principle of protection is applied to most chemicals. Most chemicals need to be applied to a plant to protect the surfaces of the plant. So if a disease is a known problem at a known period of time or known environmental condition, and you have a susceptible plant, it's important to consider applying a chemical or organic product that can protect the plant from infection. Our next principle is eradication. This is where we're removing the disease or the pathogen from the garden or landscape. It can also be applied to removing diseased parts of the plant so that disease does not spread within the plant. Our next principle to consider is therapy. This is where we're applying therapeutic treatments in order to increase the health of the plant so that it can defend itself or reduce the spread of the infection within the plant. This is particularly important in trees where they have the ability to compartmentalize decay within the wood of the tree or within the stems of the tree. Therapeutic treatments can include deep root fertilization to improve the aeration of the soil, to provide sufficient nutrients for the growth of the plant, and to improve the conditions and properties of the soil. After all, improving the soil has a large effect on the overall health of plant. Now that we have an understanding of plant disease management, we can talk about our control tactics. We can group these tactics into 4 different categories. We have cultural, biological, mechanical, and chemical. Our cultural control measures include a lot of different management strategies. Overall, the cultural tactics include improving the conditions that we're growing the plant to provide optimal growing conditions, to consider all our horticultural and agricultural practices in order to provide the best environment for it to grow and maintain its health. But cultural control strategies can include simple aspects of cleaning up diseased leaves that have fallen. to prevent the spread of the disease throughout the growing season or from season to season. Another control tactic is biological. This is where we're using biological organisms in order to assist us in controlling plant disease. For instance, some diseases can be controlled or prevented by applying a non-pathogenic organism on the surfaces of a plant in order to protect it from being infected by the pathogen. These microorganisms compete in the environment for this niche. This prevents the pathogen from being successful. Another tactic is mechanical. Mechanical control can be simply removing the pathogen or pest from the plant in order to cure the problem. Another tactic is chemical control. Oftentimes people go straight for this particular tactic, but we actually want to consider our chemical control tactic as our last resort. If chemicals are used as a control tactic, it's important to use them properly, to follow the label so that they're as effective as possible and have the least risk of impact on the environment. But also, we don't want to misapply a chemical and it become toxic to the plant. So we've reviewed our principles of plant disease management. We can cover this topic more in detail. I appreciate you leaving a comment down below to provide me with some feedback on what you would like future videos to include. I appreciate you watching. If you did enjoy the video, I encourage you to click the like button. And I do appreciate if you could subscribe to this channel. Thank you for watching.